You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
This is Steve Sansweet of Rancho Obi-Wan, and you're listening to the 602 Club.
Welcome to the 602 Club, Trek FM's local watering hole, coming at you from some unknown part of the Star Wars galaxy. I am just one of your hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and with me, as she is almost every single week, is Christy Morris.
I'm here and delighted to be back to talk more Star Wars. Hey, we don't get to do that much here.
No, we just don't. No. I mean, it's about to be big with Star Wars because, you know, we've got the Rise of Skywalker coming out. As we're recording tonight, they just dropped the last trailer for The Mandalorian. That's right around the corner. Mm-hmm. Next year, we have the Clone Wars last season. You know, we know Kenobi's coming. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of stuff coming. The biggest thing is we don't know what's going to be next in the theater after the end of the Skywalker Saga. So...
I believe there will be plenty more.
Yeah, I'm sure. But I feel like it's in good hands when it comes to what they're going to be doing through Disney Plus. So I'm just beyond excited about that. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're going to be talking about one of the lead-in books for The Rise of Skywalker, the journey to the Rise of Skywalker. We're on Spark of the Resistance. But before we get there, just want to, say, hey, help out the show. We actually just turned 5 years old as a podcast. So, woo! Yeah, if you love what we do here and you've never given us a star rating review over there on Apple Podcasts, please do that. Let people know what you think of the show. Help it grow. We've been going for 5 years, but the best way to keep the podcast going is to continue to see it grow. And then the best way to grow is honestly through more star ratings and reviews. So please do that. It means the world to us when you do, and we read your thoughts out on the show. But you could find us wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Trek FM online. We're on @TrekFM on Twitter. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We've got our listeners-only discussion group, and that's a place where you can talk to listeners from all over the world about what we're doing here on Trek FM and the different shows. If you want to talk about what we're talking about here on the 602 Club or anything else, go to the Babel Conference on Facebook. You can get there by typing Babel into the search field on Facebook, or you can go over to the website at trek.fm, and any of our show pages, there's a button that says discussion. Click that, and it'll let you in. So many different places you could do that. And the reason that we can bring all of these shows to you every week, we have an incredible group of associate producers here through Patreon. Ken Tripp, Davis Grayson, Wyatt Millett, and Daniel Noah. They've been supporting our show for a very long time. And the entire network. It's a lot to put all of this on what we do here on this network, and we can't do it alone. We can only do it through the assistance of listeners just like you. So go to patreon.com/TrekFM, become part of our team. We also have some great contribution levels you can give at to get even more perks. But honestly, every little bit helps. So we just encourage you, patreon.com/TrekFM. Well, Christy, with this book, as we mentioned, we're talking about Spark of the Resistance. And so as with any of the Journey to series, we've gotten the Journey to the Force Awakens, Journey to the Rise, the Journey to the Last Jedi, and now Journey to the Rise of Skywalker. And so each of these is meant to in some way set the stage for what we'll get in the movie. This year, the things that they're doing to do that are, there's this book, which is a middle grade book, the Spark of the Resistance. They have a comic series, Star Wars Allegiance, which is currently running now. And in fact, as we're recording this, but the day this comes out, the last issue of that is coming out. And then there will be 2 adult books. There's going to be a book called The Force Collector, or it's just called Force Collector, not The Force Collector. And then there's another book that's coming out right around the corner as well called Resistance Reborn. And so that's what they're using to kind of build into this time period between The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, which there's actually a time period between the two movies now, other than like 24 hours or whatever. So, this book, I just want to ask you, that's part of what it's trying to do, is kind of set the stage. So I just wondered how you thought this book does with that first mandate of trying to set that building towards what we'll see in The Rise of Skywalker.
I think that it does it okay. You can definitely tell, even if you don't know exactly what's going on yet right after The Last Jedi, you can tell when you start this book that that's when it's set. By, their statements of different things that are happening, you're going, okay, we've got Rose at this point. It's Rey kind of on her own now. She doesn't have Han with her. They're talking about General Organa, which kind of brought a tear to my eye the first time they mentioned her this time. But sort of like they're on their own. It's just Rey, Rose, Poe, and BB-8 together on a mission. So I like it from that aspect, and getting to see them really branch out and have to do something in a small group like that. When really we did not ever see Rey and Rose together in The Last Jedi. So getting them kind of having a partnership now was interesting. But I like too that they've started this journey to the next movie, because it's not required reading, but sometimes it is nice to kind of add to your experience with the movies and build in a little bit more in the gaps.
Yeah, any of these places, your goal, I think I've said so many times, we're talking about tie-in fiction, and the same is true for when I was doing, literary treks. When a book for tie-in fiction can add to your experience of a movie or TV show and enhance it, that's perfection. That's what you want. So it is an example. Last week on Aggressive Negotiations, John Mills and I were talking about the last run, the last arc for Charles Soule's Darth Vader, the Fortress Vader arc. And we were talking about how much that adds to our experience then of then seeing Vader in Rebels, and then also seeing Vader in the original trilogy. Mm-hmm. Because of the experiences there. So, that's what you want. And what's great here is that you don't quite know how this is going to necessarily build into the movie until we see the movie.
Right.
But it gives you that opportunity then, if it's done well, which we don't quite know yet, but I feel like there's a few hints at some of the things that this book is possibly like leading towards for the movie. If they've done it well, you'll think back and be like, oh yeah, I read that in Spark of the Resistance. And that's what that little piece of, like minutia in the background, or that one mention of this person, then there's that whole story that impacts, how you view the movie. So it's always fun to kind of read these, either comics or books, and then see how well they actually had built you towards the movie and add to that as you're watching it, so that as you're triggered, basically, like, oh, that's that character. And like, they may just be in the background, but like this whole other story with them, and how they know other characters that in the story. So that's one of the things I think that helps. And I think you mentioned too, this is a book that sets characters together in our core group now that haven't spent a lot of time together. The only characters here that have spent a lot of time together on screen are Poe and BB-8 and Rey and BB-8, but not together, right?
Right.
And then Rose hasn't really spent a ton of time with either of them at this point. So you have this group who you get to experience them on a mission together, and that's part of that too. And I think we'll talk a little bit more later, kind of how those dynamics work out and all that. But that gives you some idea of then hopefully building towards the movie as well.
And I meant to ask you as well if you felt like there was a lot of familiar things happening in this story that we may have seen elsewhere. It was kind of funny. There were a couple pieces that really stood out to me where, for example, when I don't know if it sounded familiar to you, when they they're down in the tunnels on this planet Minfar. You know what it was called?
Yeah, I think Minfar is correct. Yep.
And there is an invisible bridge that they find, and they've got to figure out how to get across to the other side. And I'm going, haven't seen that in Indiana Jones before.
Yeah, they definitely, they definitely, the author here, she has used a few references to other things, which, I think, that happens a lot. I was just reading a Star Trek book recently, getting ready for a Literary Treks episode, and there are a few different allusions to different franchises in there, just little winks. So they definitely do that. But yes, that actually plays kind of a big part in here. What did you think? Like the whole story here is that the characters here of Rey, Poe, and Rose, along with BB-8, they're on a mission to pick up. They're basically on a supply run. They're on a target run,
right?
And Intergalactic Target Run, and they're on their way back to the Resistance, and they get a distress call, and so the question then became like, do we answer this distress call? Do we not answer this distress call? And so this whole story is really about the Resistance trying to rebuild itself so that it can stop, the galactic domination of the First Order,
right,
when there was only 12 people left by the end of the Last Jedi, and kind of showing what some of those things are like, which is trying to get these supplies, and all that kind of stuff. So how did you feel about that part of the setting the stage?
I think that it did do its job, and it kind of even reminded me of the Leia Princess of Alderaan book, when you have to make these decisions which determine your character, and one of those is Rey saying, what should someone who's working with the Resistance do in this situation? You can't just ignore someone who's in need of help. Just because it could be risky, it doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do. So I like that they really harp on that in this book, and that it reminds you of who Rey is, even though she's had these moments in the movie with Kylo where you're wondering if maybe she is possibly having doubts about the Jedi, or if he is possibly going to be redeemed. I like that this Rey reminds me of her ties to the Jedi, and that she is a good person, and that she really is going to lean on the side of the Resistance.
No, that I was gonna say, I think that's an important key in here, because the thing that Poe and Rey and Rose come to is this idea that we have to answer this distress call, basically,
right,
because you can't just do what's right when it's easy. And they also do the right thing in the sense that they put themselves in the shoes of the people calling for help and say, well, what if that was us? How would we want people to respond to that? So really, it's basically they're living out the golden rule of, do unto others as you would have them do to you. And that's exactly what the side they fall on. So I think you're absolutely right. Them playing that out shows these to be the heroes that we want them to be.
Yeah.
Because they make the tough choice, which, they're on a supply run for the Resistance, which is an important thing, but also they feel the desire to make sure if they can help somebody, they should help somebody. And even if it's going to be difficult for them to do so.
Although it does kind of crack me up now thinking, whatever happened to finishing that initial supply run? It's like they went off on a side quest and then broke down, and now you don't know when they're going to get back to the whole supply run piece.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of the things where I felt like, in many ways, this book kind of reminded me of early episodes of Rebels, where they were doing a lot of supply run things that I felt like, picking up supplies from one place and, sending them to another place. And so this had a lot of that, which is fine, in many ways, when you're thinking about this kind of building up of the Resistance again, this is all going to be stuff you have to do. And so really you hope that this story then becomes more about the character building for the characters we're with than necessarily the story, because that's kind of, where you would hope it would go. I did think it was interesting, though, just talking about this, they mention in the book a part of the story that we're reading in the Allegiance comic, and they ruin it.
Really?
Yeah, by having this come out, and if you read this book right away and you haven't finished the comic series, I mean, we're going to spoil that too, but the Leia's whole mission with Rey in that storyline is going to Mon Cal to ask Akbar's son for help, and the resistance that they find there to that idea of helping the resistance. And we don't know if they completed their mission yet, but we know now that they did complete their mission because we read it in this book. And it's like, I was really actually surprised because this book seems to come after that comic series. And what I've seen online is that the Resistance Reborn book is actually kind of the first book in continuity. And then it would be the comic series, and then it would be this book. So I was a little disappointed then that they just didn't release Resistance Reborn first on Force Friday, and then released this book after at least the comic series was done. Because it just seemed strange to me that they would ruin a story point for that comic in this book.
Yeah, I mean, at least let you know, maybe ahead of time, you should actually read them in this order. I mean, because that's unfortunate. Thankfully, I didn't know.
Yeah, and I would say, too, that this is one of the things that they have done that I haven't been such a huge fan of with the new canon. If you pull out any of your Legends books, the old Legends books, there's this massive timeline in there to let you know, and every book would be put on the timeline where it goes. And they've been kind of wishy-washy because these books are quote-unquote canon, and the comics are too, at placing them definitively in the timeline. And I think part of that is because they're doing that dance of, we want to be able to kind of massage it if we have to, so that we don't, overwrite something that we've done. Right. But then we can just push it and say, oh, it comes out, instead of being definitive. But it also kind of gets frustrating sometimes when you're like, you want to read these things in continuity, I'm right there with you. It would have been nice if they had just been like, yeah, you should, or why not, if you already know that as the publishing arm, why not just release them in that order then, so that doesn't happen for people. And
that, I definitely agree that they do want to, for sure, you can tell they want to have some fluidity with putting things where they would like, or at least being able to come back later and add in something in between things that are currently on the timeline. But there's still definite timing set for every piece we've had so far that you can't change. Like, this definitely comes after The Last Jedi. You can't change that. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, it would be obvious that people should have read the comic before this, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, well, and it's just so interesting because that comic, and we're going to do a supplemental episode sometime. I was already talking to Bruce Gibson, and he agreed to do it with me sometime when we can do it once it's all out. Rey and the Force are a big part of this book. Like, she's on the cover. She's the main character of the sequel trilogy. And I thought it was just this book, in some ways, was interesting for me with Rey, and in some ways was frustrating with me for Rey. And part of that is just this whole book, she kind of seems out of sorts after The Last Jedi. She's got no mentor, and she really seems to be struggling with her relationship with the Force, which to me, it just seems like a mixed bag with her as a character.
Yeah, I've been frustrated, and I'm glad that you said that, because I'm going, okay, I'm not alone then. That at this point, after all Rey's been through, we've had 2 movies, we've had multiple books, we've had her go through Han kind of being her mentor, and then wanting Luke to be her mentor, and now she doesn't have him either. I feel like at this point, though, she should have found something to put her faith in. And so I'm feeling kind of frustrated that I feel like we've gone so far now with her seemingly not have gone anywhere in her relationship with the Force, that she seems kind of still at the beginning of things. And I want Rey to be more. I was really excited to see her in The Force Awakens and to see what she could become. And I feel like she's still just trying to figure things out, when I feel like at this point, Luke had more of an idea of, okay, I'm definitely trusting the Force and the Jedi and putting my faith in that. And I want Rey to really lean into that more than she has, whether or not she has a mentor left. You know, am I making sense?
No, you are making sense. The thing that I really struck me, especially the first time that I read this book, I kept thinking, you know, the big thing about the Last Jedi, right? When Luke goes to burn down the temple, you know, the tree, and you know, he's all worried about the books then when it actually gets on fire, and Yoda tells him, Rey already has everything that she needs. Mm-hmm. And then we see that she has the books, these ancient Jedi texts. And what I think is so frustrating for me is that, why is Rey struggling with the Force? She's got the ultimate guide to the Force in the Falcon's, you know, like, drawers.
Yeah.
And is she not going to read them? Like, so, and this really bothered me, because we got the feeling from, you know, the conversation that Luke has with Yoda that he's never read them. You know, Yoda even asks him, read them, have you? Page turners, they were not. And Luke is kind of like, you know, like he's never read them. And I'm like, just read. Like, just read the book. Yeah. Like, it's right there. Like, the manual on the Force is in the Falcon. Like, why is this a thing? So I feel like, I think what I'm really frustrated with the story of Rey is that the tools are there for the storytellers, but it feels like they don't want to use them. And honestly, I feel like they're just holding it back, maybe for the movie, and that just frustrates me all the more.
Yeah. Because, I mean, even though there were parts that I liked about The Last Jedi, I did still feel like we got through a whole movie, and what did we do with Rey? I felt like all she did was fight with Kylo, and then the two of them fought against Snoke and the Praetorian Guards, but that we didn't learn anything new about Rey, that she still hasn't focused solely on building her power with the connection to the Force and trying to grow in that aspect. And that's what I want to see. So I felt like this book helps that a little bit. But then at times it feels like they're just throwing in, well, you know, I remember that one time on Crate that I was able to move some rocks, so maybe I could do that again. And it's like, well, there's more to it than moving rocks.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I'm most annoyed with her characterization is the fact that they're not allowing her to have mentors. And, you know, I don't know what that's trying to say, but to me, the only way that we grow is through the wisdom of those around us. And the most wise people around us are those that are our mentors. You know, those that have gone before us, that are, you know, been through those experiences. And I know in my life that's made a huge difference, of having incredible men who have poured into me, you know, and some amazing friends that are women that have also done the same thing. And so you need that, right? You need that experience of those that are older, who have been before us, you know, and Rey has got none of that from anybody. And I think it's just really frustrating for me. But then on top of it, she has the textbook of the Force in the Falcon, and why wouldn't you read it? And so it made me really frustrated, because it just feels like they're keeping the character stagnant, and I don't know why. And there's almost a sense to me where if you're not really going to allow Rey to grow very much until the movie comes out, I honestly don't want a book with her in it. then.
Yeah.
Because it just makes it more frustrating when there are literally story point elements that we got from the last movie that are big pieces that then we're not going to follow up on until the next movie, if that's the case.
And I would wanted to know your opinion as well on the little back and forth between Rey and Poe in particular, toward the beginning of the book. I personally wasn't a fan of them having a moment where Rey gets her feelings hurt that she realizes Poe doesn't think she's as great of a pilot as she is. And, him saying, well, the reason I kept asking you if I could fly the ship was because of that reason. And then it's playing like Rey's really hurt and now doesn't know if she can trust Poe or if they're really friends or whatever. And I feel like even for this being a more YA book, that's just not how Rey and Poe would act in that situation, or that Rey would ever think that way of it. Oh, I can't believe you thought that. No, Rey's a strong woman. She's not going to take crap from Poe.
Well, and I felt like to me, that scene between those two didn't feel congruent with either of these two characters.
Yep. I agree.
Now, Poe wondering if Rey is as good a pilot as she is, of course he would think that. You want to know why? Poe ain't ever really seen Rey fly.
Right. So it'd be natural for him to wonder.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, this is the first time that we've had them on an extended mission together. So, of course, Poe would have no idea if she could fly, and he would offer his services to fly because Poe does know he's a great pilot. He's literally one of the best pilots, if not the best pilot in the galaxy.
And he'll tell you that.
Yes, he will. But there is legitimacy to back up his claim too.
Right.
And we've seen it. We saw his flying ability in the Force Awakens. He single-handedly shot down like 12 TIE fighters above Maz Kanata's destroyed castle. So,
yep.
I mean, that whole scene just seemed like the characterization there for both of the characters was completely off. So, I do think the moment where Rey really does have a good, fantastic moment is the point in which she stops. She's going to use the Force, and instead of trying to enforce her will on the Force, she just listens instead.
Yes.
She immerses herself into the Force and then allows it to guide her instead of, her trying to use it as some kind of weapon. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, at least we got some movement with Rey and her connection with the Force, where Rey has kind of seen is that it's not about just using the Force. It's about allowing the Force to flow through you and then work in concert with it. And if she'd just read the books, I'm sure they would have told her that. But, I'm just glad at least that we got that moment, because that was actually, I thought, a great moment. And that's definitely, anybody who doesn't have a mentor, this is the type of thing that where they would be like having to kind of learn on their own. And so, yeah, I really appreciated that we at least got that with her.
Yes, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I felt the same way. I felt like it was kind of ironic because I feel like sometimes we don't even realize things about ourselves until we say it out loud to someone else. Sort of like you're teaching someone else how something works and then suddenly going, oh yeah, maybe I should follow what I'm telling you to do. And so I felt like Rey had that moment where she's telling Rose, that's not how the Force works. I can't just call my friends through the Force whenever I feel like it. And then later has this moment of, I just need to pause and listen and let the Force flow through me, like you said, instead of trying to make the Force work for whatever she wants.
Yeah, no, and I think, in the end, that's the place where, instinctually, the place where, when the Jedi were at their best, that's who they were people who were working in concert and in tune with the will of the Force, not imposing their will on the Force. Because the more you do that, the more you kind of become the dark side, which is because you're using the Force as a tool for your own selfish gain.
Exactly.
Instead of, listening to the will of the Force and doing that. And so, again, I just think that would be something that would, I'm sure, be in one of those ancient Jedi texts. She should just crack those open and read. And we know that Rey can read because before the Awakening book mentioned that she had all of these like computer programs and books and stuff that went along with that. That's how she taught herself to fly with a simulator. So Rey is not uneducated. It's not like she has those books and she can't read them. So it's, yeah. What did you think? We got Poe and Rose here in the book, and how did you feel about the characterization with those two characters here in the book?
I felt like Rose was very spot on with what we've seen before of her. And I did kind of like her better.
Like Little Miss Sunshine?
Yeah. And it's funny because I didn't like her as much in The Last Jedi. Just as a character, it felt like it kind of made her an angry child, and then suddenly tried to force a romance between her and Finn when maybe it didn't happen as organically. But here I kind of liked Rose a little bit better because I feel like you're learning more about who she really is deep down. And then I liked the whole back and forth between Rose and then Rey and Poe talking about how Rose thinks that, well, if we take one of the First Order's weapons, but we're using it to accomplish something good, then it's okay, right? And it's her more wanting some validation. It was a question. She wasn't sure. And I like that Rey is coming back and saying, definitely not. There are weapons that General Organa would never use, regardless of how you're planning to use them, like Starkiller Base. And I like that then Poe agrees with Rey, and they're teaching Rose how all of this works. Because Rose is pretty new to the Resistance and everything, and so I like that moment. Poe, I love as a character, but here I felt like the author kind of made Poe into this teenage boy who came across a little more moody. They kept mentioning his gorgeous hair, and it felt like out of place.
I mean, who else has that hair?
Right? Because all the stormtroopers are taking notice.
I mean, maybe they're female stormtroopers. You don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, like, yes, stormtroopers can be any gender. That's fine. But I feel like the hair comments I counted at least 4 or 5 times, and it just wasn't necessary. And I felt like you can tell a good story with Poe without having it just be about his looks or him putting Rey down.
Yeah, so I am right there with you. I felt as though what we were getting with Poe, there were some moments where, like, especially his dialogue was right on target. It felt like something that Poe would say. Mm-hmm. But this is kind of something that I had a problem with all of the dialogue in the books, is that many of the times I just kind of felt like they felt too generic. Like, again, Rose kind of feels like, Little Miss Sunshine, and Poe, like you said, kind of feels a little bit more like a hotshot teenage boy, and then Rey feels a little bit more like the moody teenage girl. Mm-hmm. And so, and instead of feeling like, the characters, and I think I don't know if it's just that we don't have as much time that we've spent with these characters, so we really know their dialogue, but it just didn't feel as real. And I do agree with you. I think Poe is the one who suffers the most from that in the book, where you're just like, I just don't think Poe would act like that. And they did try to acknowledge that some of the lessons that he had learned, he wasn't quite as much of a hothead. There was a moment where he thought about maybe running into, danger, basically, and he decides not to because he's learned his lesson, basically, and stuff like that. But it just seemed odd to me because, The Last Jedi's whole thing with Poe was basically supposed to be about turning him into the leader of the Resistance, the one that everybody would look to in the end. And here, he didn't feel like the person that movie was trying to make him into, like that we would really look to him. He still felt too much like, I don't know, he just felt a little bit petulant about pouting about not getting to fly, and like we talked about earlier, his whole interactions with Rey. And so yeah, I think the dialogue characterization of all of them kind of suffers, but I felt like for Poe it suffered the most.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like, now that you mention it, like the petulance of it with Poe, it feels like he's been punished by his mom and now he's being a little bit more cowardly. After his whole interaction with General Organa in The Last Jedi, now he is being sulky. Yeah, and I mean, from what we got at the end of what we got there at the end of The Last Jedi, that's not what I would expect at all from him. It felt like he had really kind of like, at the end of that movie, he had learned his lesson, and he was going to be, somebody that everybody could look to. I mean, there's even that whole scene at the end where, Leia makes the point of saying, "Why are you all looking at me? Follow him." Mm-hmm.
So it just seemed a little bit strange that we would kind of come, down on that side with Poe. We do have some other characters in the story, and there's Glenna Kipp, who's that scientist in the book who had been working with the Empire, but she had been trying to help from the inside keep things from going haywire, which she realizes doesn't end up working all that well. And then she's quote unquote working with the First Order, but really she's just using them to try and get to Zion, to save the Zion, the that's what I call, I think it's how you would say the species, but this species of killer green bunny rabbits.
Yeah, I was like, so green Ewoks? I don't know.
But like bunny Ewoks.
Okay.
Yeah. So, so what did you think of her character then in the story?
I think the biggest thing that bothered me about this whole book was her background, because it felt too science fiction for me. It definitely bothered me that it became about, there was this secret lab and she's a scientist and had other scientists that were working on something. And then they kind of tried to make it into, it was a mind control device, but it still came across to me more like the plot of something I would see on the Sci-Fi Channel than it does a fantasy or a space western. It just really, that annoyed me and didn't feel like it was supposed to be in Star Wars. So I didn't like that to begin with, but I like the character arc in general that she kind of goes through, with starting out meaning well with developing whatever that was, and then it kind of blowing up in her face, and then having to try and turn things around from there, and realizing she's a good person and wants to help the Resistance, but doesn't know how to without getting caught. So she's going to help the First Order or act like it, and then flip later. But it did get to where it felt like there was just too much going on with her when she's then trying to come up with a way to make Rey, Rose, and Poe trust her by doing something. Did you feel the same way?
Yeah, it was interesting because I just read, I'd never read the Jedi Academy series by Kevin J. Anderson, and there's a character in there called Quizux, I think is how you'd say the name, and she is an Imperial scientist, and she's the one, at least in the Legends continuity, who's responsible for drawing up most of the plans for the Death Star and helping them create things like that, or then the Sun Crusher, or, World Devastators and things like that. And so, it got this feeling like that character where you talked about, it kind of feels like hard sci-fi. It feels more sci-fi-ish than sci-fi, or than space fantasy. Mm-hmm. And I kind of got that feeling a little bit with Glenna Kip. And, I didn't quite have a problem with them having this kind of mind control device, the echo horn, and apparently it only really works on the killer bunnies, on this planet.
Right.
But, I don't have a problem with it. I mean, obviously, the thought of the Empire having scientists to do things, I mean, Rogue One is all about that, right? Galen Erso and his group of scientists and stuff like that. So that part wasn't too much. But the part that felt a little bit much for me is that apparently she's been around a long time and she knows Leia and stuff. So she has this other, it felt like they were trying to do too many things with the character.
Right, like they're saying, oh, we could tie her back into this story, and you're going, okay, whoa.
Well, and because of that, the book felt like it, in some ways, it needed to almost be longer to help justify who this character was in all these different areas.
Right.
Because there just wasn't enough time to spend with her to kind of build that in a way that felt a little more organic to the story, other than just throwing in, by the end, how she knows Leia and stuff. Just it feels like a little bit much. It's like, if she had just been this character who was basically trying to redeem herself, I think that would have been enough.
Right, don't mention it if you're not going to go anywhere with it. It wasn't necessary to make it a good story.
And I mean, that's one of those areas where, who knows, it could be a thing where they mention something in The Rise of Skywalker, or maybe she's in the background, or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe they will.
Or maybe she's just mentioned, because they also mentioned that she could be a great spy, so maybe she's, a spy contact that they meet or something. I mean, so they could utilize it, but I mean, at least for the story of this book, it did just feel like a lot for this one character to kind of have been, either responsible for or linked to. Yeah.
And it really, I have to add, the other thing that bothered me that I felt like was unnecessary was her back and forth with the commander on the First Order ship about constantly correcting him to call her professor, and constantly stating why she only calls him by his first name instead of commander, whatever. I just felt like that was unnecessary too. I'm like, yeah, you can mention it once, but it doesn't need to be this constant thing. I get it.
Well, and I think, that Commander Spiftz, or
that's what it was.
Bran Wayne, yeah. He was probably the worst character in the book. I mean,
Thank you.
He just comes up as this stuck-up, non-reading egotist. And I think what I was really frustrated with is that, why is everybody in the First Order just a big boob?
Right.
That's what we turned Hux into, a just complete goofball. He felt like Dark Helmet from Spaceballs was more realistic. And now this guy, he just comes off as the most comically evil guy you could have, who's just out for themselves, and there's nothing about it that feels realistic. It just feels super cheesy. And super, I hate to say, but just kind of dumb. He comes off as dumb. And so if this is the First Order and you're trying to make them really scary, there's nothing scary about this dude. He's just an idiot.
And I think that, is a mistake in the writing. I think in that point, I would have told it differently and said, at some point, given him some kind of a win, something to make him seem more brutal, menacing, intimidating, something to be a threat. Because I do think you hit that point perfectly, saying it's really not a threat for anybody in this whole story. And then him having this superior, Hydrek, who is supposedly going to come in 2 days and take over everything. So he's got to hurry up and get his job done. That didn't really help it either, because even after that point, they don't give him a win. So it just feels like, why is he even here? He's a bumbling fool.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. When you make your hero is only as good as your villain.
Yep.
And when your villain is nothing but a big boob, like, why would we be scared of them? And then it makes your heroes feel less, because they're not really defeating anybody who's a challenge. And so
and that's
you're just
where,
not doing yourself any favors.
That's where Rebels was so much better than this, because bringing in Thrawn was such a big deal, because he was a huge stake for the Rebels to have to deal with. He was constantly on their tail, and he wasn't constantly striking an attack either. He was observing and then hitting them where it really hurt, and doing things like taking Hera's Kalikori, these things that hit someone to their core, that are not just like, oh, I'm gonna, take your dog. It was something deeply meaningful.
Yes. I think, one of the things that you mentioned there really hits the nail on the head. We've seen Star Wars do villains well.
Yes.
Like, Darth Vader is obviously one of the most memorable villains in all of Star Wars, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have characters like the Emperor, and then you have characters like Thrawn, and Darth Maul, and like all of these different types of characters that are scary and really well done villains, and make you fear for your characters' lives, because you don't know how they're going to be able to beat this bad guy.
Right.
Because this bad guy is serious business, right? I mean, like, they take their job of villainy very seriously.
Right.
But it's because they don't think they're villains, right? They think they're doing what's right and best for the galaxy, and that's what makes them truly scary. And
whereas this guy only cares about getting promoted.
Yeah, this guy doesn't care about anything other than himself, and in a way that doesn't even make him seem like a threat.
Yeah.
And that's just disappointing. Like, you've got to be able to create villain characters that when your heroes overcome them, you feel as though it was an accomplishment.
Right. And here you just feel like everything was pretty easy.
Yeah. What did you think of the Zion, the killer green bunnies who live in kind of the underground area, which that part sounded super cool. That world building part with like where they live and all, I thought was...
Yeah.
That felt like a really cool Star Wars idea.
Well, and reminded me of more things from Rebels. I feel like we've seen that, and I can't remember what episode.
Oh, with Malachor? Yes.
Yes.
The plant. Yep. I thought the exact same thing.
So, there were a lot of moments in this book where I was going, that's kind of from Rebels. That's kind of from Rebels. So I did feel familiarity with this kind of environment, and was glad to be having something like that again. Because that is something that you don't see a lot, where it's, you're going underground or, underwater. So I like that aspect, but I felt like there wasn't really a lot of explanation as to why they live there, how the ground is opening and closing. I don't know. I just felt like there was something kind of lacking with the building of the actual species, not as much their world, that I just wanted more and felt like it fell a little flat. What did you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I felt like I wanted kind of a little bit more there. I thought it would have been nice if we had gotten a little bit more.
Like not just a physical description of them, like a history.
Yeah. I think that's part of the thing where we just could have had, if we had a little bit more time to the book, I think it would have been nice. So we just didn't,
So, I mean, they were fine.
I mean, it's okay. I thought that they were relatively acute, characters and stuff. I thought they were kind of like semi-interesting. Yeah. I felt like like you said, we could have just had more. So, what do you think of, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, and the one of the things I thought was really great about the story is how we got this whole idea of how we fight and this question of what weapons will we use to win this war. And it's something, obviously, it's a big discussion in the Clone Wars. So I thought it was really nice to see them using this here. And so I thought they did a really good job with bringing that here to the sequel trilogy, and these characters have to wrestle with that discussion.
Yeah, that's something I feel like we constantly see through everything in Star Wars, and that I'm glad that was brought into this story and gave it a little more weight that it needed, was talking about how they fight is what determines who's on this side of the Resistance and who's on the side of the First Order. Because the First Order is going to use tools to oppress people and to cause people pain to get to means to, so that they're a means to an end. Whereas the Resistance, their ultimate goal is to use things to build people up and to encourage community and for good. And so they are complete opposites. And I like that Rey and Poe are telling Rose, we can't take a First Order weapon and try to use that thing that was intended for evil in a good way, or think that we're using it for good by using it against the First Order. Then we're just becoming like them. And so I think that's the most important piece, is always discerning that line that you don't cross.
Yeah, to me, this was a really good discussion in the book, and it's a really important one. I think, with this being a middle grade book, it's a great discussion to have, that it's not just important that we fight. The question is how we fight, because that reflects then on who we are. Mm-hmm. And I loved the idea, like you mentioned earlier, them having the discussion that there are some weapons that we can't use. There are some weapons that are too awful to be used, and they mention, obviously, Starkiller Base is one of them. That things are just tools, but there are some things that are so awful and really only have one purpose. Yep. That the tool itself is evil. And I think that's a really important thing to be reminded of. That just that not everything in this world is just equal, that is just neutral. Mm-hmm. There are things that are totally not neutral in our world. And I appreciate that they really dive into that idea for this book, and they make the characters discuss it, and they also just make the characters have to think through that idea. Right,
like they even kind of have a debate where Rose says, well, I mean, the stormtroopers use blasters and we use blasters. How is that any different? And so I like that Rey comes back and draws that line in the sand and says, that's different though. That's not like something that's inherently evil like Starkiller Base. These are just tools that can be used either way. And I mean, generally, the rebels or the Resistance are going to try not to kill people, if they don't have to. But I feel like the First Order always is going to be using people as just a means to an end, and that people are expendable. I mean, specifically with having stormtroopers in the first place, they're faceless people that are just disposed of all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, what's great what's great is how that, goes all the way back to, discussions you have throughout the Clone Wars and you have throughout the original trilogy, and now you're having here, and it's an important question to discuss because the how we fight separates the sides of good and evil.
Yes.
And it's, obviously the characters fall on the right side here, but I thought that's probably the best theme and it's just the best part of the book, them having these discussions. And I also love, too, one of the reasons that they realize this is because they're able to see the impact that it has on the Zion people, right? I think that's a good thing, like to see the impact of a weapon like this on actual beings.
Right.
Was really smart. And so I'm just glad that we got to see that, and we got to see then our characters react to that in a way that I think is just really helpful. So yeah, it's good. For things this book does well, I think that is one of the best things that this book does. So
yeah, I absolutely would agree with that as well. I think too, it's kind of funny. I don't want to go on for too long, but it reminds me of when a good friend of mine, Thomas Harper, was talking about war crimes because he's in the military. I thought that was a perfect comparison to talking about how in Star Wars they discuss that how we fight determines our character, that war crimes in real life have been defined because of that fact, that there's certain ways that you treat people that would create a really terrible person, and that just you don't do when you're discussing appropriate rules of engagement and rules of how you treat prisoners of war and rules of how you fight on the battlefield.
And I mean, again, some of the best Star Wars has done that, had that discussion. What is it that separates us from those that we call villains? And I think, the fact that we have these new characters having this discussion, it's good. And so, for you, if you were going to rate Spark of the Resistance, where do you come down, do you think?
For me, there were about as many negatives as there were positives with this book, so I'm going to put it right in the middle of the road and give it a 3 out of 5. Just because it really bothered me the way that they treated Poe, like we said, about him just kind of being a moody teenager in this book instead of really getting much to do or really being how I think Poe would behave. I also felt like there were a lot of things that could have been done better with the background for Glenna Kip and for, the how'd you pronounce it? The Zixon. The Dijon people.
Mm-hmm. I've been calling them the Zion people, but I have no idea if that's correct or not. So.
Yeah. The natives, we'll call them that.
Yep. The green bunnies.
Yeah, the green bunnies. I felt like there just was a couple little weak plot points that I would have liked to see more development for. And then would have written Poe a little differently. But otherwise, I think that the themes are good. I think that it's an interesting story for Rose, in particular. And then also, especially this theme of how we fight is what matters. So I like it from those aspects, but generally I would give it a 3 out of 5.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think you're absolutely right. This is a 3 out of 5. And part of that is, I think we just rightly mentioned, some of the things that just don't stand up. And part of that is the characterization that we get in the book with the characters. And I think, what's frustrating is that you would have hoped that this should be a book that is about the characters, and their characterization. And it's a little disappointing that it's not as well done as it could have been. And if it had been done slightly better, I think I would have enjoyed the book more, and it would have stood out more. Because, again, building these characters towards what we get in The Rise of Skywalker is really the most important part, So, all in all, it's not a bad book. I think it's, if you're looking towards, just kind of readying yourself for The Rise of Skywalker, not a bad place to start. But I don't know if it's necessarily a must-read. I wouldn't say so.
Yeah.
But I'm excited is every week we have to get to your recommendation.
Yeah, so I'm going to go a little backward at this time and talk about something that I was introduced to by my husband and absolutely became obsessed with. Like, I would say my biggest fandom is Star Wars, second biggest Harry Potter, and this would be my third. If you guys have not seen Firefly, it was a Joss Whedon show. It was on Sci-Fi Channel. It did end up getting canceled. Poor Joss. So many of his things get canceled. But it was so good for what it was. And also ties in with the movie Serenity. So you need to see all of that if you haven't. And I believe you can watch it on Amazon Prime at this point. May have to pay to rent it. But it's incredible. Nathan Fillion is the lead character, Captain Mal. Got some really amazing other actors, including Alan Tudyk. Who doesn't love him? So yeah, I highly recommend Firefly.
Well, that'll be the only person who recommends Firefly on this episode.
Excuse you?
I do not like Firefly. That's a whole other podcast.
Oh, stab me in the heart.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but it's funny. I'm going to go all the way back. So my wife has been watching the original season of Survivor.
Oh, man, that's old.
Available. Yeah, it is available on Amazon Prime. They have a bunch of the seasons, not every single season, but they have a lot of them on there. And it's been fascinating to watch through some of the episodes with her because I've been watching the show since the beginning. But I mean, that's so long ago.
I mean, seriously, what, like 10 years?
It's been longer.
Wow.
I mean, they have over 30 seasons now, so it's incredible. But it is fascinating to go back and see the genesis of everything. It just really is how it starts. And I mean, what's fascinating about it too, I think, is just this was a whole new brand of television. It was something completely new. Nothing like this had really been done before in the way that they did it. And it is totally worth going back and checking out, mainly because so many people, I'm sure, actually these days probably haven't even seen the original season.
I did.
So if you have Amazon Prime, yeah, it's worth it. Yeah, I did too. So it's been really cool to kind of see that play out again. But yeah, so I check out the original season Survivor if you've got Amazon Prime. Totally worth it. But Christy, if anybody wants to catch up with you and see what else you are up to, where can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at BespinBell if you want to chat. I also am in the Babel Conference. And then you can find me as far as a couple other shows that I do. Other than 602 Club, I do a show once a month with women from around the world called Planet Leia on the Fantatrax Network, where literally women from 6 different places on the globe talk about Star Wars. So anything under the sun related to that. And then my next one would be my show with my good friend Teresa Delgado called Sabers and Spells. We're actually recording our next episode this week of Halloween, as you listen to this. So that's coming out soon. We'll be talking about Disney Plus and all the exciting stuff we're going to watch on that. And finally, I do a segment on my friend Riley's show, The Star Wars Report, once a month called Fashion in 5, about men's and women's Star Wars fashion. And the one for October is going to be chock full of stuff because I don't know if you've seen, Matt, but there's a ton of stuff now in Star Wars fashion in the Disney parks, among a million other things.
Yeah, there's a lot coming out. And there's a lot available, which is actually pretty cool. So I love getting new stuff. I just got a brand new Mandalorian t-shirt.
Oh, they look so good.
Yeah, it's so great. So, yeah, definitely check everything out that Christy's doing. It's totally worth it. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero under the name MattRushing02. You can find me here on the network doing The Orb with Chris Jones, talking about Star Trek Deep Space Nine when we get a chance to record a new episode. You can also find me on the Nerd Party Network. I do 2 shows there. One is called Owlpost, and I do that with Dre Kaufman. We talk about Harry Potter, each and every chapter of Harry Potter, so make sure you check that out. It's a lot of fun as we do that. You can also find me over on Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills, talking about Star Wars each and every week as we are getting into all of the goodness that is coming out Star Wars-wise. Don't hesitate to check it out. And then last but not least, I do a show called Cinema Stories with my good friend Courtney. That is where we talk about films, but through the lens of faith. But thank you so much for joining us.
And y'all come back now, you hear?